What's going on, bibliophiles? Welcome back to Poetry and Prejudice. If you are new here, my name is Barry Ramirez. Welcome to the channel and thank you sincerely for watching. What we're going to be doing today is reviewing and discussing my first manga read. I'm talking about Uzumaki, out of the blur. You can do it. You can do it. Uzumaki by Junji Ito. I believe that's how that reads. My Japanese is it's non-existent. Honestly, I've never had the crazy mad desire to read manga. I've read graphic novels in the past, and I know manga is not technically a graphic novel, but they're similar. Work with me here. I've read graphic novels in the past, and even though I enjoyed them, and some of them were amongst my favorite works of literature, such as, for example, Watchmen, From Hell, or V for Vendetta, obviously an Alan Moore fan, I just found that they weren't my thing. I just love classic literature, but I was reaching a point in my reading where I just kept reading classic after classic after classic that I really wanted to try something new. I was watching Tim Pool's podcast, Timcast IRL, and he was having a discussion with someone about building culture, and he made a reference to this manga, Uzumaki by Junji Ito. He gave a brief synopsis and he talked about how it was about a coastal Japanese town that became haunted by a spiral. And I was immediately fascinated by that. Quickly hopped on Amazon, looked it up, and swiftly also placed an order. But what really drew me in, what really made me want to read this manga, was the idea of a haunting by a pattern, a spiral. Most of the horror stories that I've read or that I've even heard of are about hauntings that are typically supernatural. There's usually a beast or monster or ghost of some kind, and immediately that drew me in. As a recent manga initiate, I had trouble initially actually navigating the book. I knew that manga was supposed to be read backwards, but I didn't really understand what that meant. I didn't understand that that actually means entirely backwards, that you're supposed to start from the back of a traditional book and move forward that way. So I started at the beginning of the book and just tried to read it backwards from there. But within 4 or 5 pages, I started to realize that there was something awry with the logic of the story, and so I had to flip around and find the index, which was at the end of the book, and then I actually started reading it properly. And I will say that that kind of took me a bit of time to get used to reading from right to left as opposed left to right, and also flipping pages the opposite direction. But on to the story. Uzumaki is about a coastal city in Japan called Korazu-choi, at least I believe that's how you say it. And it tells the tale of how the city and its inhabitants become infected with spirals. The protagonist of this story is Kiri, and we follow her throughout the story as she tries haphazardly to unravel the mystery, pun intended, of the spirals. From the beginning, it's very clear that many of the inhabitants of Korazu-choi have become obsessed, or even, I would say, hypnotized by the spiral. So much so that they can't help but see it in nearly everything. This aspect of the novel was very reminiscent for me of a movie called 23 with Jim Carrey in it, where the character played by Jim Carrey couldn't help but see the number 23 in everything. And because he kept seeing that number in everything, he became so obsessed with it that it literally drove his character crazy. I found the obsession of the inhabitants with the spiral to be initially very fascinating. And this is because I believe that there's an almost metaphysical quality to the spiral itself as a pattern. I don't think I've heard anybody else discuss this in relationship to Uzumaki, but, and I'm no mathematician, I am not a math professional in any way, but there is this concept in geometry called the golden spiral. And a golden spiral results essentially when a spiral has the golden ratio. It creates almost like a perfect spiral, so to speak. And some people have even termed this as the divine proportion, which is to say almost like it's the language of God, or even the coding, so to speak, almost like the DNA, if you will, for reality, simply because it is so pervasive in nature. Almost anywhere scientists have gone to kind of look for this spiral structure, they've been able to actually find it. Just some common examples would be like the insides of a sunflower, as you see like the sunflower seeds twisting in a spiral, or for example, like with a pine cone. But as the story goes along, the characters move from being merely obsessed by the spirals to being literally infected by them. And I use that word with some precision. The spiral almost affects these characters like a virus. A virus will attack the weakest constitution of a person, whatever part of their body that is feeble. But in this case, the spiral seems to affect the characters in the way that they are most weak in their character. So it's more of a psychological, so to speak, infection, even though the way that it manifests itself is through contorting their body in a way unique to their weaknesses. Take just as an example, a student that goes to Curie's high school. This particular student is noted for being lazy and slow, for being, in other words, lethargic. And what starts to happen with this character is he becomes infected by the spiral. And as he's going to class, people start to notice that there's this weird kind of bump forming on his back. And initially they're kind of like asking about it. Well, what is that? What is that? And it seems to be in the form of a spiral. As time goes along, it becomes clear that he's growing a shell. And that shell is the shell of a snail. So he almost comes to symbolize the thing that is most weak about his character or his constitution. He is a person who demonstrates laziness or lethargy, a kind of cardinal sin, if you will. And he's punished for that in the form, or by rather, the spiral by turning him into a snail. Or take, for example, another one of Curie's classmates. There is a girl who becomes jealous of Curie when she recognizes that she's become infected with the spirals, but they've only affected her hair. And this has actually allowed her to garner the eyes, so to speak, or the attention of her fellow classmates. And this character becomes envious of Curie because she's getting the attention that she is not getting. She also, I believe, remarks at one point that she's so much prettier than her, something to that effect. And so what happens is that she's assisting her with her hair, and she becomes herself infected by the spirals. And the spirals attack her in the same way. She starts to develop hair that has spirals in it, but it eventually gets to a point where it's like so out of control. It's like Princess Leia on fucking steroids, and the hair is all everywhere and spirals. And so she's able to get all of this attention, but that ironically eventually ends up in her death. But you can see the same thing going on here. The spiral is attacking the weakest part of her character, in this case her vanity, in the form of a sin, a cardinal sin, envy. Or take another classmate of Curie's who is rather famous at the high school for jumping out and scaring people when they are unsuspecting. There's a series of events that lead to him dying. I won't spoil that. And he, on his death, actually turns into a spring, oddly. He turns into a jack in the box. But once again, you see kind of the formula that's playing out here. You have a character who has an idiosyncratic behavior or a particular weakness, and the spiral affects them in a way that's unique to them and manifests itself in this peculiar way. In this case, this kid turning into a jack in the box, which is freaky, weird, interesting, and cool, I would say. I would say that this aspect of Uzumaki is, to borrow a word from the literary intelligentsia, it is very Kafka-esque, which is to say that it's like Kafka's work. In particular, it reminds me of his short story, The Metamorphosis, which, if you have not read, you really, really should. In fact, I should probably do a review on that at some point. But to give you a brief synopsis, it's about a character named Gregor Samsa who works as a salesman and who is treated, I would say, insignificant in almost every facet of his life. And as a consequence, one morning he wakes up and finds himself transformed into, depending on what translation you read, a beetle or a cockroach, an insect of some kind. And you can see that same element working itself out here in Uzumaki. You have a character, has an idiosyncratic behavior or flaw, and is transformed into that thing. In a weird way. As truly intriguing as these metamorphoses, is that a word? That doesn't sound like a word. As truly intriguing as these transformations are, I would say that they go on far too long, which is one of my main criticisms of Uzumaki. The chapters, at least in that first half of the book, are very formulaic. They have the following formula. A character is introduced, that character is shown to have an idiosyncratic flaw or behavior. They become infected by the spiral. The spiral transforms them in a way that is unique to their idiosyncratic flaw or behavior, and eventually they perish as a consequence of it. This goes on and on and on for about half of the book. And at a certain point as a reader, you're like, okay, I get the point. I see what's going on here. But what was even kind of further annoying about this is that as this is happening, there isn't any foreshadowing going on. There isn't any real hints about what is to come in the latter half of the manga. There's no hint as to what is causing this catastrophe, causing this hypnotism with these spirals, which you kind of need if you are telling a story that is a mystery. Hell, I, as a reader, would even be willing to be misled. Throw a red herring in the story. Make me think that one thing is causing the spirals, and then it turns out to be another. But really, there's no swaying one way or the other. You're just kind of left to try to figure out what this mystery is without any help from the author. I also found it very, very bothersome how many of the characters reacted to the other characters becoming infected and transformed by the spirals. It struck me as severely naive. Take, for example, Kiri, the protagonist. Every time someone becomes infected and transformed by a spiral, she is absolutely flabbergasted, astounded, astonished. Now, don't get me wrong. The first couple of times, it's understandable. If tomorrow my best friend becomes infected with a spiral, starts growing a shell, and turns into a snail, I'll be like, holy shit, what the fuck is going on? Where are these spirals coming from? How is this happening? But if after that, his wife turned into a spring and his grandmother turned into a screw, I wouldn't be really, really, really surprised when his great-great-great-grandmother, God rest his soul, turned into a sunflower. It just wouldn't be as surprising. But nonetheless, their naivete is fresh. Every time it happens, it's like it's the first time that they've seen the thing happen. Now, honestly, these three things taken together, the formulaic plot, the lack of foreshadowing, the characters' horrendously naive reactions, put me on the brink of putting this book on the bookshelf and letting it gather a mound of dust. However, one thing kept me reading, and I'm glad it did because the latter half of the book does pick up. But the thing that kept me reading through that first half of the book was the art, which is beautiful in a horrifying way. So I wanted to show you guys a couple examples of the kind of art that is in the book, the kind of drawings, so that you get a sense of what it is that really motivated me to continue reading. So this is an example where one of the characters has been, see if I can get it in there. There we go. Has been transformed into a spiral. Now, this is kind of two-page spread here, but you see what it is that I'm talking about. That's horrifying, but at the same time, in great detail and beautiful in a brutal way. Let me show you another example here that I thought was particularly distinctive. This is where a character has become infected by the spiral, and it's boring its way into her forehead. Look at that. It's absolutely beautiful in a horrific way. And then the last example I'm going to show you guys here, and of course this thing goes on throughout the manga, it's truly beautiful in a horrific way, is when these bodies have become tangled in a spiral in the row houses, which we'll talk about shortly. They become almost knotted up like octopi. Gorgeous in a hideous way, if you know what I mean. Now, the plot in the second half of the book really starts to pick up, and I'm really glad that I stuck around for it. It opens with the desolation of Korozu Choi. We learned that everything has been desolated. Everything has been razed and reduced to rubble because the infection of the spirals, the plague of spirals, so to speak, has become so pervasive that it's literally destroyed almost everything. In fact, so pervasive is the infection that it's even infected the air. If somebody breathes too strongly, the push of the breath can actually cause a tornado. Now, despite all this destruction, we learn that one thing has not been destroyed. It is the row houses, which are ringed around, albeit scantily, ringed around the pond in the center of town called Dragonfly Pond. Now, we had learned through a slight hint in the first half of the book that these row houses are haunted. And I thought, this is perfect. This is the kind of thing that I was looking for in the first half of the book. This is foreshadowing. It's giving me a hint. It's telling me that the row houses are in some way related to this spiral infection. There's also something very ironic going on because these row houses are ancient. They've been around for a very long time in Japan, and they are old and rickety. So you would think, ironically, that they would be the first things that would be knocked down from the infection of the spirals, and yet here they are standing, because there's something very intriguing going on with these row houses as it relates to the spirals. Now, there's a lot of details that happened before what I'm about to tell you, but I don't want to give you guys too much of the story if you are interested in reading Uzumaki. But eventually what happens is that Kuri and a gang of people, including Suichi and her brother, try to flee Korozu Choi and attempt to get away from these spirals. And they flee up into the mountains and go into they find out, magical forest. When they go into this forest, they find that it's just looping around in a spiral, like everything else. But what's also looping around in a spiral is time itself. When they go into the magical forest, it turns out that so much time has passed that by the time they come out of the forest, they're able to get a vantage point of Korozu Choi, and they see that almost all of these row houses have been reconstructed, and in you guessed it, a spiral around Dragonfly Pond. Kiri and her boyfriend Suichi go down and investigate what's gone on with these row houses, and they actually find that they are actively under construction by the people who have fled into them, trying to protect themselves from the infection of the spiral. But even they have not been able to get away from it, because they are turned, as you guys saw in the drawing, into almost like octopi people, where they have become entangled in a knot, but they are actively working to build the row house nonetheless. In the eke of time, they're able to get out of the way of this active construction, and they're not kind of imprisoned in, and they find at the center of the town a spiral descending staircase that they, perhaps foolishly but necessary for the story, decide to descend. And eventually they fall into the spiral, and they land upon a horde of carcasses, stone carcasses of all the people of Korozu Choi who have been sucked down into the spiral. And what they also find here is that there is an almost magical, peculiar, I imagine it as being golden. There is a certain light in there, although there's not coloring in the drawings. But there's a almost spiral city that is made of, well, spirals. Now, the manga very quickly ends here, but it ends in a way that for me simply did not land, because it seemed like Ito was trying to be romantic, because as Suichi and Kiri are lying on the ground, they decide that they kind of can't live without one another, and they decide to finally let this spiral take them over. And kind of in some of the last scenes, what ends up happening is that they clasp hands together, and they're kind of like twined into eternity, so to speak, as they become infected with the spiral and as they become stone. Now, as I said, this didn't land for me, and the reason is because of the characterization. The relationship between Shuichi and Kiri throughout the manga has not been one that is romantic in nature. I would say that the relationship, even though we knew that they were in a relationship, has not been in any way romantic. In none of the scenes do we ever see them kissing, holding hands, making love. In fact, despite the fact that we are told that they are together, we probably wouldn't have guessed that they actually are. So when you have this ending where they're lying together and they're holding hands that become twined into eternity, so to speak, it just really struck me as discordant. It seems very inharmonious with the rest of their characterizations. But for all that, I would say that it's an interesting ending to the book. I found it to be fascinating that there is this spiral city underneath that is in some way causing this spiral chaos, the spiral infection in Koruzutroi. But what really also kind of nagged me about this was that there's no kind of like further explanation as to what caused the city itself, because the city itself seems to be infected by the spirals. And so it's kind of like that example in philosophy where you have like the causal explanation. It's like where, what does the Earth sit on? And somebody says a turtle. And then what does the turtle sit on? A turtle. Another turtle, another turtle, another turtle, right? The idea is that you never kind of like really get to the cause of what causes anything, because you can always ask the question, well, what causes that? Which may very well have been the point that Ito was trying to make here as it concerns the spirals, but I just wanted a little bit more. I wanted to know like what really, really caused these spirals other than the spirals. I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. That is my review of Uzumaki by Junji Ito. I'd highly recommend this book to you if you are someone like me who has just found that your reading life has gone a bit stale. If you've read traditional book after traditional book, classic after classic, and you want something that is unique, alien, and otherworldly, I think this book certainly satisfies that quality of being otherworldly. Now, even though I was disgruntled with many aspects of the book, I would say that the art within it is worth, so to speak, the price of admission. It's truly beautiful. Many of the drawings are in a horrific way, but I found that I really, really enjoyed that. Now, I would say I wouldn't recommend this book for you if you were someone who like reads almost exclusively for plot, because particularly in the first half of the book, you're going to be very, very bored very, very quick. I would also say you're probably not going to like this book if you are somebody who is very, very squeamish, particularly as it relates to bodily contortion and, well, body damage, because there's a lot of that in this manga. If you enjoyed this content, hit that like button, smash subscribe, hit the notification bell so you can be informed when I drop more videos on poetry and prejudice. Also, I have recently started publishing my poetry on Substack. So if you guys would like to read my own poetry, you can do that by clicking the link down in the description below, putting in your email, hitting subscribe, and you will get a notification anytime I publish a new poem. But that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time.